Good day. The last 24 hours, the reports that have been pouring in from the Ukrainian battlefronts over the course of the last 24 hours suggest that yesterday and last night were again particularly bad for Ukraine, possibly even disastrous from Ukraine, though it's always a little difficult to decipher some of the reports, and one has to be careful before one assumes that the reports necessarily are true. But anyway, we're getting an accumulating story now of things going from bad to worse and of a general operational crisis, not just in one particular sector of the front, but increasingly in all of them. The first thing to say is that last night, apparently witnessed the biggest ever drone strike, Geranium 2 drone strike on Ukraine. Allegedly, 75 drones, Geranium 2 drones, were launched against Ukraine. Now, these are Ukrainian figures, and it seems that these drones have now been considerably refined and adapted by the Russians. They are produced by the Russians themselves now. The days when the Russians were importing Geranium 2 drones from Iran have gone. The factories in Tatarstan that were set up to create them is presumably now in production. And it seems that these Geranium 2 drones that Russia now operates have been modernized in all sorts of interesting ways. Firstly, it seems that their guidance systems have been considerably refined, but perhaps more importantly, it seems that the structure, the materials from which these drones are made, has been converted by the Russians to carbon fiber and other products, the overall effect of which is to make these drones more stealthy, less visible to radar. And I noticed that a couple of days ago there was a report that Ukraine is now urgently requesting that the United States supply advanced air defense radars. This is apparently a new demand, a new request that is coming from Ukraine. And I wonder whether this is partly the reason that the Geranium 2s are becoming increasingly difficult to track by Ukraine's existing radar network. And of course, that may also be true of other Russian weapons as well. By the way, whether the United States will be prepared to supply radar technology, advanced radar technology to Ukraine remains to be seen. Radar technology is usually, technologically speaking, particularly sensitive, especially the most advanced radars. And this is probably especially true of the United States, which has placed a very heavy investment in stealth, developing stealth capabilities for its aircraft. And besides, advanced radars of this kind are not the easiest things to manufacture in quantities, and these radars are probably extremely expensive and in relatively short supply. And I would have thought that before the United States could even consider supplying these radars in quantity, a new budget appropriation for Ukraine would first have to pass through Congress, which, however, I suspect will probably come before very long. Anyway, this is an interesting and developing story. Of course, the United States agreeing to supply the radars, supplying the radars, getting the Ukrainians to learn how to use the radars, or perhaps finding people in the West, mercenaries and contractors who have the knowledge of how to operate these radars, and who are prepared to go to Ukraine and risk their lives to do so. Anyway, all of that will take some time, probably several weeks at the minimum, months more probably, unless these systems are pressed into service prematurely and use untrained operators, which would, of course, negate some of their advantages and might put them at risk. But anyway, it is interesting that, as I said, Ukraine is apparently now urgently demanding these types of radars from the United States at the very time when we hear that these Geranium 2s are becoming more difficult to track. And incidentally, I wonder whether this increase in the stealth capability of the Geranium 2s might explain another mystery or apparent mystery that people are talking about. There was two recent satellite pictures of the airbase, the airfield, and just the airport. I believe it's the Zhylyeny airport near Kiev, which is where at least one of the Patriot missile batteries is based. This is the same airport, by the way, against which the Russians delivered that Kinjal strike many months ago, which they claim destroyed several Patriot launchers. The United States would only admit that one particular launcher was damaged. Anyway, that issue has never been resolved. My own views about it have been made clear in the past. I think the Russians did inflict serious damage to the Patriot system based there. But anyway, the Americans, whatever damage was done, repaired it, replaced it with new Patriot launchers. Germany has supplied more. And this airport has been until recently, a major place, location where these Patriot missile batteries were located. And on the 7th of November, a commercial satellite took a photo of this base, and sure enough, it shows the Patriot launchers there. Now, on the 25th of November, apparently, another photo was taken. I'm not at all the kind of person able to read and what to look at and examine and make much sense of these satellite photos. But anyway, another photo was taken on the 25th of November, and it looked as if the Patriot launchers had all gone. There was no sign of actual damage to the airport itself. So suggestions that I've seen some make that the Patriots have been destroyed doesn't seem to be true, but they seem to have been removed from the airport. Now, there may be any number of reasons for this. It could be that they've been deployed to some other place, or it could be that the Ukrainians or the Americans or someone else are becoming worried that the Patriots are too exposed at this particular airport and that they need to be deployed, therefore, in some safer location. I mean, there could be any number of reasons, and I don't know what the reason is. But if I could just speculate slightly, I wonder again whether the fact that these Geranium 2s are becoming stealthy and more difficult to track is becoming a cause of concern for the safety of these Patriot systems, in the sense that in the Persian Gulf, Houthi militia from Yemen have been able to bypass Patriot batteries with drones, less sophisticated drones than these. And this has been a cause of great embarrassment, by the way, both for the Saudis and for the United States. I wonder whether somebody in Washington or Kiev, perhaps worried about potential risks to the Patriots, took the decision to move them and put them out of harm's way. It would be, of course, titanically embarrassing for the United States, for Ukraine, for the entire Western alliance, if the United States, the West's most advanced air defense system, was damaged by a small carbon fiber drone. Anyway, that's just one suggestion. As to the actual damage that this drone strike did, it's not entirely easy to say. It's not entirely easy also to get a sense of what the targets of this drone attack were. But nonetheless, despite the usual Ukrainian claims that large numbers of these drones were destroyed by the Ukrainian air defense system, it does seem that at least some of these drones got through and that they did inflict significant damage on various Ukrainian facilities. I should say that the Russians have recently resumed launching drones, these Geranium-2 drones, towards Kiev, and the latest drone strike included attacks on Kiev itself. And of course, there have also been attacks by Geranium-2 drones in every other part of Ukraine as well. And as I said, I'm not going to try to tot up the damage, but despite Ukrainian claims, it is clear that there was quite a lot. Now, there is continued speculation about the Russians stockpiling cruise missiles, which of course, if they strike a target, would do enormously greater damage than a relatively small and light Geranium-2 drone. The Ukrainian authorities now say that they think Russia has up to 900 drones stockpiled, more than they estimated Russia had in advance of the winter offensive, cruise missile offensive last year. We have no way of assessing that, but of course there is concerns about what the Russians might do with all these missiles once they decide to use them, and what they might be planning to do with these missiles when the moment comes to launch them. Now, I've already made clear what my own view about this is. I think that one reason why the Russians are holding back missiles is simply an issue of cost. These missiles are expensive. Geranium-2s are extremely cheap. Why use expensive cruise missiles to conduct an aerial offensive on Ukraine when you can send scores of cheap Geranium-2 drones every night to do it for you? And I think that people are underestimating the importance of this factor and discounting what I suspect is the increasing effectiveness of these Geranium-2 drones. So that's one thing. Secondly, it is quite likely that the Russians are stockpiling missiles. They almost certainly have a bigger stock of these missiles than Ukraine is saying. That seemed to me to become clear over the course of last winter. But I suspect that there might be another reason why we are seeing fewer, we haven't seen these big long-range missile strikes take place for a while. And there might be another reason, which is not one that people are discussing and commenting about, which is that I would not be surprised if the composition of the Russian cruise missile force is changing. The Russians were already making modifications to their KH-101 subsonic missiles, which were the mainstay of the missile attacks last winter. Drones, subsonic drones, launched from Russian strategic bombers, Tupolev 95 bombers. There were already signs over the course of the last winter's offensive that over the course of that offensive, the Russians were modifying and adapting these missiles in order to defeat Ukrainian defenses. It's quite likely, it seems to me, that the Russians are using this pause to carry out more modifications to these missiles. And it could be that when the next missile offensive takes place, we will find that these KH-101 drones are very different from the ones that we saw before. But there is another factor which perhaps people are overlooking, which is that over the course of this year, the Russians have been introducing the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile into service with their navy. It seems that this is now in serial production, and it could be that part of the production base, the factories, some of the factory space has been reallocated to production of this particular hypersonic missile. Now, I don't know how cheap it is, how easy it is to make. I don't think anybody outside Russia knows. It's likely to be significantly more expensive than the KH-101. But I, for one, would not be at all surprised if we started to see Zircons being used in the Ukrainian battlefronts at some point when the Russians resume their offensive. Now, their missile offensive. Now, bear in mind that Zircon is considered to be a naval anti-ship missile. That is how it is most widely perceived. But all Russian anti-ship missiles, as we have now seen, have land attack capabilities. The Onyx supersonic anti-ship missile, for example, that the Russians have, has been used regularly now to carry out strikes on land targets over the course of this conflict. And I would not be surprised if the Zircon, supplementing the Kinjal, of which I suspect production has also been increased, that the Kinjal and the Zircon might play a bigger role in the Russian missile offensive which is to come. The Kalibr and the KH-101 cruise missiles, however, will, I am sure, continue to make up the bulk of production, and most will make up most of the missiles that are used to conduct the strikes. It's because obviously they will be much cheaper. But anyway, it could be that those two will be significantly modified as well. The Russians have shown great inventiveness in fielding new weapon systems over the course of this war. We've seen how the Lancet drone has been introduced and has evolved and developed at extraordinary speed and acquired a range and capability that nobody imagined when it first appeared. We've also seen that other Russian drones have been appearing, that production of tactical drones like the Lancet has increased to astonishing levels. So, given that the Russians have been so inventive in developing drones, why would they not be equally inventive in developing their missiles. Just saying. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. So that was one story, a big Geranium-2 drone attack, coming after, by the way, several nights of these attacks. They're now becoming a regular occurrence right across Ukraine, night after night, and they are doing quite a lot of damage. The actual fighting on the battlefront has also, however, been going very badly for Ukraine. Now, the most dramatic events and the bulk of the information we have been getting has been from Avdeyevka, and I think it's perhaps premature to talk about a complete collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Avdeyevka, but maybe that would not be too great an exaggeration to describe what is happening in the southern perimeter of what one might call the Avdeyevka defense system. Now, yesterday I said that it seems as if the Russians have now fully captured the industrial zone south of Avdeyevka, and even Ukrainian sources are now confirming this. It seems that the Russians have also made more advances in this place called the wetlands, which I'm not really sure quite what it is. I wonder sometimes whether maybe the wetlands, as I said, aren't connected with this filtration plant, and that those aren't in some ways also a name for an industrial district, as opposed to a natural feature. But anyway, I'm not fully sure. But it seems that over the course of the capture of this industrial district, with Russian armored vehicles now advancing deep into the former Avdeyevka defense zone, the one that the Ukrainians created. There's pictures of them operating now beyond this industrial district. Anyway, with Russian armor, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles pushing forward, it seems that other Ukrainian units somewhat further to the west of this industrial area, in places like a district called the Tsar's Hunt. Apparently it's a leisure district, and the Tsar's Hunt is specifically the name of a restaurant. But anyway, this is what this whole district is called. Anyway, it looks as if the Ukrainian troops who are still located in that area are at serious risk of becoming encircled. And it's been speculated that they might have to evacuate. They might have to abandon their positions, because if they don't, then they will face encirclement in that way. And should that happen, it will bring the Russians right up adjoining the Avdeyevka metropolitan area, the residential area, from the southeast. And apparently this collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the industrial area is now putting also Ukrainian defenses in this filtration plant area also at serious risk. And it could be that the Ukrainian defenses there might crumble as well, and that the Ukrainian troops might have to be evacuated from those places also. Now, there are lots of reports that not only are the defenses, the Ukrainian defenses in this part of the Avdeyevka battlefield rapidly collapsing, but that large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering and are being taken prisoner. And there was even a report I saw this morning, which, by the way, I cannot confirm, but there was a report that a unit of 150 men, that would be an entire company, perhaps a reinforced company of Ukrainian troops, that they have surrendered to the Russians en masse in this particular area, which would be certainly one of the biggest surrenders that has taken place over the course of this war, if it really has happened. I want to make it clear that this is a very, very, it's a fully uncorroborated report. I don't know for a fact whether or not it is true. But anyway, the situation clearly in the southeastern area of the Avdeyevka defense zone is collapsing in on itself fast. And there have also been more news for the Ukrainians that suggests a deepening crisis in other parts of the defense zone as well. Now, about a week ago, I discussed on one of my programs a on-the-spot report, or a report from a Spanish journalist who had reached the village of Ostyashenia, which is close to the Avdeyevka battlefront. It's now, by the way, that particular village is now well within the target range of Russian artillery. But anyway, this Spanish journalist interviewed a Ukrainian soldier who was discussing the defense that the Ukrainians have been trying to keep together along the railway line to the west of Avdeyevka, northwest of Avdeyevka. And he said that this railway line is an important barrier. If the Russian tanks were able to move beyond the railway line, they could potentially advance and seal Avdeyevka off entirely. And this particular Ukrainian soldier appeared to see the entire future of the Battle of Avdeyevka hinging on control of this railway line. Now, it is largely acknowledged that the Russians have managed to capture and occupy large stretches of the railway line since that El País article was published. And there have been various claims that the Russians have advanced further west and have at least partially occupied the village of Stepove, which is west of the railway line and not far from the village of Berdichi, which possibly is a major Russian objective in this area if they do want to close the retreat options for the Ukrainians in Avdeyevka and interrupt their supplies to Avdeyevka. Now, these claims about the Russians having advanced to Stepove have been disputed, but we now have seen, apparently those who know about these things say they have seen, I mean, I've seen the video myself. It is a video which shows Ukrainian FPV drones, apparently, trying to target Russian troops who are identified as being in Stepove. So this provides confirmation that the Russians do, at the very least, have a presence in Stepove. We don't know. I don't know whether this entire village has been captured by the Russians. There's some reports that it has not been. There were reports previously that the entire village was in the grey zone. Whether or not the village is still contested and being fought over, which perhaps it is, the fact is that we now have apparently secure film evidence that confirms, and this is recent film evidence, very recent film evidence, that confirms the presence of Russian soldiers in this village. And there is a further piece of film evidence which conceivably is even more concerning for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians have provided film, I believe it is the Ukrainians, of Ukrainian attempted FPV drone strikes on Russian armored vehicles west of the railway. So the Russians are now apparently deploying armored vehicles west of the railway. Now, Dima at the Military Summary channel, where you can, by the way, see all of these videos, he has made the point that these armored vehicles are currently under heavy attack by the Ukrainian artillery some way to the north and west, and that the Ukrainians are also launching large numbers of drones to strike at these armored vehicles. Clearly, an intense battle is going on, and again, it's difficult for me with my vision to say exactly what kind of armored vehicle it was that was caught on these pictures, but it struck me that it was an armored personnel carrier of some kind, probably a BTR. It doesn't seem that the Russians are, for the moment, able to send tanks across the railway, or at least they haven't attempted to send tanks across the railway so far. But the Russians, we also learn from multiple reports, there's been reports about this in the US media recently, they're developing enormously effective electronic warfare systems, and of course they have strong air defense systems. It seems that the Ukrainians have been throwing all of their electronic warfare and counter-electronic warfare assets into the Avdeyevka area, and that has made it more difficult for the Russians to use their unquestioned superiority in electronic warfare to maximum effect in this particular part of the battlefronts. But of course, the Russians now have an incentive to do that. They will probably, given that they're now conclusively across the railway and able to start sending armored vehicles across the railway, they will presumably concentrate more over the next couple of days on pushing back further against the Ukrainian artillery, and no doubt they will also be enhancing, upgrading their electronic warfare capabilities in this particular area. And one way that they might, by the way, one thing that they might also do is that I noticed that there was a report in one of the Russian media, there was a Russian media report, it was in Izvestia, which said that the Russian Defense Ministry is now working to replace all of its Uragan multiple rocket launch systems with Tornado S systems. And we are told, I'm taking this from Izvestia, that the Tornado S can destroy the enemy with high precision strikes at distances of up to 120 kilometers. The Tornado S is apparently, it's one of the systems that is comparable in some respects perhaps even superior in some respects to the American HIMARS system. Apparently the Russians have been deploying them increasingly on the battlefronts, and it seems that they're starting to appear in this particular area, the Avdeyevka battle zone as well. So anyway, there we have it. We have major crisis for the Ukrainians. It seems that the Russians are advancing aggressively in the southeastern areas of the Avdeyevka front. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses there are in the process of collapse. There are reports of large numbers of prisoners being taken, and there's also strong possibilities that if Ukrainian troops in some locations there follow through with orders, obey orders to stand and fight, that they could be surrounded and presumably destroyed as well. And we also have visual confirmation now that what that journalist from El País was told by a Ukrainian soldier, the worst nightmare that the Ukrainians in Avdeyevka might face, Russian troops consolidating control of the railway line and able to send armor, tanks and armored vehicles west of the railway line. That appears to be in the process of happening. So a major operational crisis in Avdeyevka. Moreover, it is becoming clear that because of the importance that Zelensky and his government attribute to Avdeyevka, the Ukrainian command is having to pull units from all across the battlefronts to try to hold the positions in Avdeyevka. And I saw on Slavyangrad, this Telegram channel, which, as I said many times, is not just a very good reporting channel about the war, but also an exceptional site aggregator and analytical place. Anyway, I saw on Slavyangrad a post which gives a list of the various units that the Ukrainian military are pulling or have pulled from various parts of the battlefronts as they try to switch forces to try to hold positions in Avdeyevka. And I noticed that Dima at the Military Summary channel spoke about another mechanized brigade, a specific mechanized brigade in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, which has also had to be pulled out of that area for urgent redeployment to try to control this operational crisis in Avdeyevka. And all of the commentators who are reporting on these redeployments make the same point, which is that the reason that the Ukrainians are having to engage in these fire brigade tactics, are having to move troops from one part of the battlefronts to another, is because Ukraine's reserves were burnt up during the fighting in Bakhmut earlier this year, and still more so during the summer offensive, so that Ukraine is now short of reserves that it can send to plug gaps in the holes in the battlefronts when these appear. And of course, this mobilization that Zelensky was talking about yesterday, and which is apparently going to be formally announced next week, is intended to fill these holes, to plug these holes, at least in manpower terms, though, as I've said many times, calling up young people and women who've no experience in military training is going to mean that if these holes are going to be filled quickly, the only way to do that will be to send poorly trained young men and perhaps women with only very limited amounts of training to the front, and that will only increase still further the already catastrophically high level of casualties that Ukraine is suffering from. And on that topic of reserves, I've also seen some estimates as to the numbers of Ukrainian troops currently going through training programs in Europe. Apparently there's about 10,000 of them, of whom 4,000 have been trained, are being trained to conduct some kind of operation across the Dnieper River in Kherson region. Part of the plan, I suspect, that Milley and Zaluzhny hammered out back in the late summer, early autumn, when they met to discuss the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive. So 4,000 men being trained for that operation, another 6,000 men, 10,000 in total, nowhere near enough to fill the gaps. And since I'm talking about the planned operation to cross the river, I should say straight away that I think 4,000 men is nowhere near enough, just as the forces that were deployed for the summer offensive and which were trained by the West were nowhere near enough to make that offensive succeed. But anyway, we have had more news, more information from Krynky, from the that particular part of the battlefronts. It's perhaps more ambiguous than some of the other news we're getting, but there was more film. Again, Dima at the Military Summary Channel discussed it. More film showing Ukrainian troops in Krynky trying to get on a boat to try to evacuate Krynky to escape to the West Bank, the Ukrainian-controlled West Bank. And the Russians caught them. The Russian surveillance drones caught them. This happened at night, but as we've discussed, the Russians now have drones with night vision devices, and both the boat and these men were attacked, and the boat was destroyed, and it presumably is the case that most of these men were killed or wounded. But anyway, that's what's happening there. One gets the sense that this particular bridgehead, if one can call it that, is now under extraordinary pressure. And, well, we'll see how long the Russians continue to tolerate it. I suspect that the Russians have allowed the Ukrainians to remain in Krynky, partly because it's a good place to inflict further losses in this war of attrition against the Ukrainians. Anyway, 10,000 men being trained in Europe, nowhere near enough to fill the gaps. These are, of course, trained men, not sufficiently trained, perhaps, but at least they're going to get some training. These women and young people, if they are called up, they will receive, presumably, even less training than that in order to fill the gaps. But it's not manpower that is perhaps Ukraine's most pressing problem. It is equipment, ammunition, ammunition above all, perhaps. Aircraft, obviously. The Russians have been shooting down more MiG-29s. Tanks, numbers of infantry fighting vehicles. And again, we see that whatever attempt Ukraine was making, apparently, to husband its forces with the latest deliveries of Western tanks, those attempts, because of the relentless Russian pressure, are apparently being abandoned. Yesterday, I discussed the fact that Leopard 1s have apparently been spotted in the Liman area. And yesterday, the Russians, on the Russian side of the war, a photograph was circulating of what is alleged to be an American Abrams tank in the Kupiansk area as well. 30 of these tanks, according to the United States, have been supplied to Ukraine. They haven't appeared on the battlefronts for some time. There were speculations that the Ukrainians were holding them back to try to build up a reserve force, perhaps to resume their offensive in the spring. It now seems that that plan, if it ever existed, is being abandoned, like the Leopard 1s. They've been pressed into battle. They've been deployed in a rush in Kupiansk, where again there were reports over the course of yesterday that the situation for Ukraine is now deteriorating again, perhaps at a faster speed. There's reports that the Russians are indeed have indeed occupied part of this village of Sinkovka, close to Kupiansk. This is on a sort of area of high ground. If the Russians capture Sinkovka and the other villages, then they would be able to advance on Kupiansk itself and perhaps capture the area of Kupiansk east of the Oskol River. So this is another potential crisis for the Ukrainians, and apparently, according to this photograph, if it is indeed a reliable photograph, and if it is indeed an Abrams tank, I'm not able to say myself, but if it really is that, we see that the Ukrainians are being forced to deploy these advanced Western tanks, these much talked about and highly touted Western tanks, to the battlefields, perhaps prematurely from their point of view. And if the situation in Avdeyevka is bad, and if the situation in Kupiansk is bad, it looks as if the situation in Bakhmut is also bad. Now, again, there was another film yesterday which appeared on the Russian side of the internet. It's again discussed by Dima at the Military Summary channel, and you can see it there. It shows Klishchiivka, this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, bitterly fought over, captured by the Wagner organization in the winter and spring of this year. The Ukrainians made a massive effort starting in May to recapture it. Around September, they claimed that they had captured it. The reports I'd heard was that it was mostly in the grey zone, though it's a fairly small place, but that the Ukrainians did have a presence in parts of Klishchiivka. Well, recent reports over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have been on the attack in the Bakhmut area. Their main attack appears to be in the north, the northern flank, but they've also been pushing hard towards Klishchiivka itself and Avdeyevka. They're fighting to capture the high ground near Klishchiivka. And this film was interesting because it was taken in Klishchiivka itself. And it's clearly a recent picture. One can tell that apparently from the climate conditions. It doesn't actually show a great deal. What it shows is Klishchiivka It's an absolutely devastated landscape. The entire village is now a pile of rubble. The only building which is still standing, which you can see in the distance, is the church, which also looks, by the way, severely damaged. And this area looks extremely quiet. There's no visible sign of activity, but as I've learnt from looking at many of these films, that isn't necessarily a sign that nobody is there. There may be men, troops, stealthily hiding in some of the buildings or in the rubble. But anyway, what one then sees is a tattered Ukrainian flag on the ground, and an arm then stretches out and picks it up and lifts it. And it does somehow convey the sense that this is the Russians basically showing off a Ukrainian flag as some kind of war trophy. And some people are suggesting that this film confirms that the Russians have recaptured Klishchiivka. Well, I don't myself think it's possible to say that on the basis of this film. It seems to me that it's possible that some kind of scout or reconnaissance party has entered Klishchiivka and filmed itself there or done something like that. But anyway, it doesn't look as if the Ukrainian positions in this area are especially strong. Of course, if the Russians not only recapture Klishchiivka and the surrounding hills, but are able to consolidate there, that, taken together with their advance to the north of Bakhmut, is going to put enormous pressure on the Ukrainians in their defense of places like Chasov Yar, and it will reverse all those bitterly fought gains that the Ukrainians made over the course of the summer and autumn in the Bakhmut area, none of which, however, as it turned out, had any decisive results or consequences. And then, last but not least, there's been a lot more reports from this village of Novo Mikhailova, close to Marinka. Again, I don't fully understand myself the importance of this village, but both the Russians and the Ukrainians seem to think that it is important. And this time the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are now on the outskirts of this village and are pressing hard to capture it. So, a massive drone strike across Ukraine by the Russians. A situation in Avdeyevka which is becoming critical, and pressure by the Russians on every other part of the battlefronts. And I have to say that the contrast with the situation in Ukraine's summer offensive, when the Ukrainians were making attacks in all sorts of places, and one got the sense that the Russians weren't under any significant pressure at all, and what one was seeing was pictures of burning Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles. Well, the contrast between that situation and what we're seeing now is really striking. One gets the sense of the Russians making significant and serious advances, especially in the Avdeyevka area, and the Ukrainians under increasing pressure in every part of the battlefronts. Anyway, that's the situation with the war. Now, there are some other things to say. Firstly, I think that the increasing bad news about the war is starting to cause nerves in some of the eastern NATO states to fracture. I don't speak yet of an outright panic, But there's been some really strange moves. Finland has now completely sealed its border with Russia. Apparently, there's only one crossing point left. The Finns are saying that this is because of the movement of the Russians are facilitating immigration, refugee flows into Finland across the border, and that they're weaponizing refugee flows. This is a common claim. Doesn't seem to me as if this is a problem on that kind of scale, and the Finnish reaction seems to me to be more a sign of stress and nerves, and especially so given that the Finns are apparently now planning to fortify the border in some way, to build fortifications along their immense border with Russia. And to someone of my age, my years, it's a strange reversal. Once upon a time, during the Cold War, it was the Soviets and their allies who fortified their borders against the West and were trying to prevent people from the East going to the West. And we had all these enormous structures being created, these walls and minefields and wire fences and things of that kind. Now it seems that countries like Finland are doing it to the Russians. And as I said, to me, it does seem like a strange reversal. Apparently, Estonia is doing the same thing. And I've heard that in Lithuania, they're now also suddenly tightening up customs checks on Russian vehicles passing through Lithuania. And I wonder whether this isn't a precursor to some kind of tightening of the borders there as well. And NATO is apparently very soon going to launch an exercise in this area. And the exercise is apparently called Freezing Winds 23. And according to Stealthier, this Russian newspaper, the Russians say that there's 5,000 NATO troops, 30 warships, and 20 aircraft participating. And this NATO exercise is now being led by Finland, which is, of course, now a NATO country. And it's been suggested by the Russians that part of the purpose of this exercise is to consider, to simulate the siege of the Russian islands of Gotland, Bolshoi Tutes, and Moshny, and to place the Gulf of Finland and the Kaliningrad region under siege. Now, there have been many such exercises in the past, and that is not necessarily new. But anyway, the Finns are now participating. The Russians have noticed this exercise, and of course, and I'm talking about it as being in some way qualitatively different. And we see that all of these steps are being made to fortify the borders. And I can't help but think that, again, this is not so much a sign of war planning. I can't believe that anybody in Washington, especially, seriously intends to launch an aggressive war and blockade against Russia in the Baltic, which would seriously get us into potential World War III territory. It seems to me that this is all a sign of growing nerves as the situation in Ukraine becomes catastrophic. Now, I've discussed in many places the issue of military production, compared military production rates in Russia and in the West. It's now, I think, generally acknowledged that the Russians, to everybody's astonishment, are now outproducing the West in nearly every category of weapons. But we've now had some very tantalizing information. It turns out that in January through to October, Russian steel production increased by 5.3% in annual terms. And this is happening at one and the same time as Russian exports of steel appear to be declining. So normally Russia exports between 40 to 45% of the steel it produces. That has now dropped to 30 to 35%, which is actually quite a steep fall. Now, Russian commentaries about this, and this is, I'm taking this information from another Russian newspaper, which is Kommersant. They're saying that this is due to a substantial increase in domestic consumption and a decline in imports of steel. And that is undoubtedly true. And it's Kommersant says that Russian steelmakers are supported by a growing domestic market as consumption in the spheres of construction and mechanical engineering is rising. And then we're told that the central bank hiking rates may be a negative factor, as it may cause a slowdown in construction activity, which could reduce demand for steel in the industry, all of which is no doubt true. But of course, steel is also an essential component in military production. And one particular very, very heavy use of steel is in munitions production. If you're making shells, you need lots and lots of steel. And I suspect that what is driving both the increase in production, at least in part, but more specifically, the decline in exports of steel, is the enormous surge that is probably taking place in Russian artillery shell production. That seems to me logical, and we're starting to see how this is affecting the figures. Now, it's important to mention again that Russia produces almost as much steel as the United States does. So we can see that though by comparison with the Colossus, which is China, China produces many times greater quantities of steel than anyone else. Compared to the Colossus, which is China, Russian steel production is much, much lower. We're still seeing a large amount of steel being produced in absolute terms in Russia, roughly the same as in the United States. And it is logical to assume that a lot of that is being converted into shells. So that's one telltale indicator about Russian weapons production. Now, on this issue, I've now received a further detailed report privately from a source about the true size of the Russian military. And this person, using various sources, now puts the current strength of the Russian army at about 1.2 million men. And of course, he says that it's continuing to grow. Now, 1.2 million men is not that far short of the 1.5 million men that those people in the Duma were talking about that I discussed recently. A vast force being put together in order to launch this, in order basically to bring the war in Ukraine to a successful conclusion. Now, the Russians will not be able to deploy every single soldier to Ukraine to fight the war there. They will need to hold back troops in many places and in many locations, because obviously Russia is a great power. It has the world's longest borders. It needs to maintain a military presence in many places, most especially at the moment in the southern Caucasus, where tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia remain high, and where Armenia appears to be drifting away from its alliance with Russia. So they can't deploy all of these forces to Ukraine, but at some point, probably they will deploy most of them. And to reiterate again, there is a vast difference between properly trained professional soldiers with a minimum of a year's training, in many cases, behind them, and very young people and women called up in a hurry, given a few weeks' training, equipped with light weapons, and thrown in to plug the gaps on the battlefronts. It's difficult. I know there are some people who still believe that this war has several years to go. I'm finding that increasingly difficult to believe on current trends. The effect of attrition has now become so visible that whereas this time last year, it was possible in the West to ignore or deny it, everybody is now talking about it, and Ukraine is being forced to take steps in response to it. And even whilst the attrition continues, draining away Ukrainian resources, we see that Russian resources, by contrast, continue to increase. This is an unsustainable trajectory. At some point, something will break, and the consistent pattern of attrition war is that when the break comes, it is sudden and it is decisive, and the collapse that comes after is very fast. One goes back, looks at the American Civil War, for example, which was in many respects an attrition war, the First World War, the Second World War. That is exactly what you saw then. And that, it seems to me, is where we are in this war at the moment. Well, I've devoted the entirety of this program today to the battles in Ukraine. I do think we are actually coming towards a decisive point. And bear in mind that though the weather conditions are now becoming colder, we're coming out of the Rasputitsa period. The full effect of winter, with all that implies, has not yet arrived. Anyway, that's me for today. Tomorrow, no doubt, more about the Middle East and other things, but this is my program for today. Just to repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also find our work you can also find our work. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And of course, you can also, if you wish, go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel. That to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.